1 night, 5 provinces, 3 islands, and a strike scale that a senior U.S. official quietly described as running approximately twice the size of the previous round. A description that, when you actually look at the full target list, turns out to be a significant understatement. Bushehr, Abu Musa, Kish Island, Avaz, Qeshm Island, all of them absorbing American strikes within the same operational window. Command and control centers dismantled. Missile storage depots and drone manufacturing sites leveled. Coastal monitoring infrastructure and naval vessels eliminated across a swath of southern Iranian territory, so geographically vast that no single regional military command inside the country could have mounted a coordinated defensive response in the time it took for the entire operation to complete. Central Command's own statement counted dozens of IRGC targets across the organization's complete operational architecture, spanning coastal territory and island positions, covering an enormous stretch of the Persian Gulf. This followed 5 full nights of no announced strikes at all, a genuine operational pause that had governments, analysts, and exhausted populations across the region beginning to whisper that this conflict might actually be approaching some kind of conclusion. Instead, Iran launched ballistic missiles into an American military base in Jordan, and the United States responded with the broadest, most geographically expansive single-strike package the campaign had produced in months. This is what maximum military pressure looks like in this particular war, and if you have not been piecing together how exactly this unfolded from beginning to end, the actual scope of it is difficult to fully absorb. To understand why this specific strike wave hit so differently from the ones that came before it, you have to appreciate the whiplash that preceded it. A conflict that had gone quieter than at any point in months. Quiet enough that serious analysts and regional officials were openly discussing the possibility of a genuine wind-down, reversed direction almost instantaneously. There was no gradual build, no incremental escalation across a series of smaller exchanges. There was silence, and then a ballistic missile attack targeting American troops. And then within the span of roughly 24 hours, simultaneous explosions spreading across 4 Iranian provinces and 3 separate islands in the Persian Gulf at the same time. The speed of that reversal, from the most sustained pause in months straight into the largest strike package in recent memory, tells you something critical about what's actually sitting underneath this conflict, even after 5 full months of grinding attrition. The underlying volatility hasn't been resolved by any of the negotiations, ceasefires, or temporary pauses this war has moved through. It's been temporarily suppressed. And this particular week showed exactly how fast that suppression can collapse. The timeline matters here, and it's worth rebuilding it properly, because the sequence is essential for understanding why this moment carries so much weight. This war has been running since February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated opening campaign against Iranian military targets. That campaign, Operation Epic Fury, struck more than 5,000 separate targets across the country in its opening days alone, damaging or destroying 50 Iranian naval vessels within the first 10 days. In terms of sheer operational scale, the opening phase of this conflict set a precedent for overwhelming simultaneous force that has shaped every subsequent chapter. What came after followed a brutal and exhausting rhythm. Strikes, then ceasefires that collapsed before they could take hold. Memoranda of understanding that both sides formally signed and then systematically violated within weeks of the ink drying. Naval blockades imposed, partially lifted, and reimposed as Washington and Tehran continuously tested where each other's actual limits were. By mid-July, Trump had ended what observers accurately called a ceasefire in name only, restarting targeted IRGC strikes after Tehran continued interfering with commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and kept launching attacks even while formally bound by agreements prohibiting exactly that kind of conduct. Then, after restarting those strikes, the diplomatic channel stayed open. And that channel produced something this conflict had not seen since its earliest weeks. 5 consecutive nights without a single new strike reported by Central Command. 5 nights of quiet. After 5 months of near constant military exchange, that kind of sustained pause meant something real to the populations and governments living inside this conflict's blast radius. It created a genuine opening for the belief that a resolution, even an imperfect and fragile one, might finally be coming within reach. Iran's ballistic missile attack on the American base in Jordan ended that window. Trump's statement was brief and direct. It was now, in his words, their turn. What followed made clear just how seriously he meant it. Central Command announced the completion of what it described as a heavy wave of strikes at roughly 10 in the evening Eastern Time, with the full operation wrapping up around 5 in the morning local time. A senior U.S. official, speaking to reporters in the aftermath, described the night's bombardment as running approximately twice the size of the preceding strike package. When you cross-reference that assessment against the actual target list CENTCOM released, it holds up entirely. CENTCOM's own language described the operation as wide, extensive, and impactful, strikes against dozens of IRGC targets, covering military command and control infrastructure, strategic missile and drone facilities, coastal defense and surveillance systems, and IRGC naval vessels and assets across the region. That is not a targeted retaliation against one specific facility. That is a comprehensive operational campaign designed to hit every major category of Iranian military capability simultaneously across a footprint, large enough to make coordinated defensive response essentially impossible. Walk through the geography and the scale becomes concrete. Explosions were confirmed across Hormozgan, Khuzestan, Fars, and Bushehr provinces, along with strikes landing simultaneously on the islands of Qeshm, Kish, and Abu Musa in the Persian Gulf. Iranian state media reported detonations in the cities of Bushehr, Avaz, and Khazarun, with additional confirmed hits on both Kish Island and Qeshm Island, the largest island in the entire Persian Gulf. A deputy security minister in Khuzestan province told state broadcasters that American strikes had targeted power infrastructure in the region. The semi-official Tasnim news agency reported that the strikes produced power outages across Avaz, a city sitting in the geographic center of Iran's oil-producing Khuzestan province. That detail deserves a moment. Khuzestan is not simply another Iranian administrative region. It is the province housing the largest share of Iran's actual petroleum production and energy export infrastructure. Disrupting power systems and command networks in Khuzestan creates economic reverberations that extend well beyond the immediate military damage, cascading into Iran's oil output, its export revenue, and the functioning of an economic sector the Iranian government depends on to sustain its own operational capacity. The decision to spread this strike package across 4 provinces and 3 islands, rather than concentrating it on a single high-value target, reflects a specific and deliberate strategic logic. A concentrated strike against one facility sends a message, but it leaves the remainder of Iran's coastal defense network, naval assets, drone infrastructure, and command architecture fully operational and capable of functioning normally the following morning. A simultaneous, multi-axis strike landing across that entire geographic footprint forces every component of Iran's southern military apparatus to absorb damage at the same moment, with no undamaged neighboring command or facility available to step in, compensate, or coordinate. A unified response in the critical hours immediately afterward. That is the difference between punishment and degradation. Punishment targets one node. Degradation targets the entire network at once. CENTCOM's stated rationale made this distinction explicit. The strikes were designed to further reduce threats posed by Iran and its proxies to American military personnel, to commercial shipping, and to neighboring Persian Gulf nations. That framing confirms this was not simply a reactive retaliation for the Jordan missile attack. It was a deliberate attempt to reduce what Iran is physically capable of doing going forward, taking offline the command infrastructure that coordinates future attacks, destroying missile and drone stockpiles before they can be deployed, eliminating the coastal surveillance systems Iran relies on to track and target vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Each command center destroyed is one fewer node in the network that plans and directs attacks. Each missile storage facility leveled is a weapon supply that doesn't exist to threaten a commercial tanker or American base next month. Each surveillance installation knocked out creates a blind spot in Iran's ability to monitor traffic through the world's most strategically sensitive waterway. This was about reshaping the playing field itself, not just responding to what Iran did, but limiting what Iran can do next. And the human consequences of that night were immediate and real. Iranian media reported 3 civilian deaths from the strikes, including a detail from Qeshm Island that is difficult to read without stopping. A residential structure on the island took a direct hit. A couple and their 2-year-old child were killed when the building they were sheltering in collapsed. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps separately confirmed that 3 of its own personnel were also killed in the American strikes. Those losses raise serious and legitimate questions about precision targeting across an operation this geographically wide, executed within this compressed time frame. Modern precision-guided munitions are extraordinarily accurate against confirmed target coordinates. But accuracy against a coordinate does not eliminate the risk that military infrastructure positioned near or adjacent to residential areas will produce civilian casualties when struck. Militaries across this conflict, on both sides, have repeatedly located command centers, weapon storage, and defense assets in close proximity to civilian populations. Sometimes that positioning reflects operational necessity. Sometimes it reflects a calculated bet that an adversary will hesitate to strike targets surrounded by homes and families. Whether that dynamic played any role in what happened on Qeshm Island is not something that can be confirmed from outside the targeting process. What can be confirmed is that a family sheltering in their own home on an ordinary night did not survive it. That reality runs through every stage of this war. regardless of which side's military planning produced it. Iran's answer came within days. Both Jordan and Kuwait reported Iranian strikes on their territory in the aftermath of the American operation. Kuwait confirmed one person killed in the exchange. That cross-border retaliation, following one of the largest single strike packages this conflict has produced, tells you something important: Iran's capacity to strike back against multiples. Neighboring countries simultaneously remains real, even after absorbing a strike wave of this magnitude. Degraded is not the same as disarmed, and the fact that Iran could respond at all, let alone respond against two separate nations within the same operational window, means whatever damage this operation inflicted, Iran's wider strike network retains meaningful operational capability. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful for tracking a conflict this sprawling and this fast-moving, go ahead and drop a like and leave your take in the comments. A strike package spanning 5 provinces and 3 islands simultaneously is exactly the kind of operation that benefits from people comparing analysis from different angles and sources. And if you want to stay with this as it continues developing in the weeks ahead, subscribing means you won't miss the next major shift. Now here's a detail that deserves real attention, because it's buried inside what this operation did not do, and that absence turns out to be just as strategically significant as everything it did. In the days leading into this strike wave, Trump had made a specific and very public threat. He warned that Iran risked seeing its dual-use infrastructure targeted, facilities that serve both civilian and military functions, if it continued attacking commercial traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Energy production sites, ports, and economically critical installations were explicitly included in that threat. And yet, when the actual target list was released, that entire category of infrastructure was conspicuously missing. CENTCOM's strikes stayed within a conventional military target set: command nodes, missile and drone facilities, coastal defense systems, naval assets. The economic infrastructure Trump had specifically threatened was left untouched. The gap between what was threatened and what was actually executed tells you something about how this war is being managed at its highest levels. Even in an operation twice the size of the previous one, following a direct Iranian missile attack on American troops, Washington still drew a hard line against crossing into economic warfare against Iran's civilian-facing infrastructure. That restraint is not incidental. Striking dual-use economic targets would dramatically expand the risk of triggering the full-scale regional conflict that every neighboring government in the Gulf has been working to prevent. It also risks global oil price shocks, capable of destabilizing economies that have nothing to do with this conflict whatsoever. So even at maximum military pressure, Washington chose to degrade Iran's capacity to project force while deliberately preserving the economic infrastructure that, if destroyed, would produce consequences far harder to reverse than any individual strike. That same pattern, degrade military capability, protect the economic foundation, has run through this conflict from Operation Epic Fury forward. It reflects a consistent strategic choice. Keep an off-ramp available. Keep the possibility of a negotiated resolution from closing permanently. Don't burn down the framework that any eventual agreement would have to be built on. There's also an important pattern worth recognizing here, one that connects directly to how analysts have tracked Iran's oil export infrastructure throughout this war. From the earliest days of Operation Epic Fury, through this most recent heavy wave, American strategy has consistently drawn the exact same distinction: degrade the military capability that enables aggression while carefully preserving the economic infrastructure that, if destroyed outright, would trigger consequences far harder to walk back from. That is not a coincidence or an operational oversight. It reflects a deliberate, repeated strategic choice running across nearly every major operation of this entire war. Even at moments of maximum military pressure, even after absorbing a surprise missile attack against American troops, Washington has consistently kept a specific category of target off the table, betting that this restraint preserves enough of an off-ramp that a negotiated resolution remains genuinely possible. Let's talk about what executing an operation this size actually requires on the operational level, because the logistics alone are staggering. Coordinating simultaneous strikes across 5 separate provinces and 3 distinct islands, all completed within a roughly 7-hour window, requires a degree of pre-mission intelligence and synchronization that is genuinely extraordinary. Every target on that list had to be independently verified through satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human intelligence sources, not just confirming a facility existed, but confirming it was actively occupied by legitimate military assets and had not been converted into a decoy or relocated since the last imagery cycle. Aircraft and naval strike packages had to be sequenced so that every target across that enormous geographic spread was hit within the same tight operational window. specifically to deny Iranian air defense operators the opportunity to reposition mobile systems or reinforce one location after watching another get struck first. That kind of coordination demands real-time synchronization between air, force strike elements, Navy assets launching from carriers and destroyers positioned across the Gulf, and intelligence analysts working continuously against satellite passes and signal intercepts to cross-reference target confirmation in the final hours before weapons release. A single miscommunication, a target cleared at the wrong moment. A facility misidentified as active when it's already been vacated. Any of those errors means either an expensive precision munition wasted on an empty coordinate, or worse, a genuine threat surviving the operation intact and available for use against American or partner forces in the days that follow. The psychological and strategic impact of simultaneous multi-axis strikes also deserves attention. When an adversary absorbs a focused single-target strike, it can assess the damage, understand exactly what was lost, and begin coordinating a response with a clear picture of what remains functional elsewhere. When explosions detonate across 5 provinces and 3 islands within the same few hours, that creates a fundamentally different operational reality, one in which military commanders and political leadership are simultaneously forced to assess damage across a dozen different locations, coordinate a response, and manage a frightened domestic population, all while their regional command networks may be struggling to communicate clearly with each other in the immediate aftermath of losing key communications infrastructure. That is the specific design intent behind a heavy wave strike package, and it is exactly why the U.S. officials' understated description, roughly twice the size, carries so much strategic weight when you unpack what it actually means in practice. It's also worth pausing on what sustaining this kind of operational posture actually demands from the American military as an institution. Reports indicated that more than 50,000 American service members deployed across bases throughout the Middle East were placed on heightened alert in anticipation of Iranian retaliation following this operation. 50,000 troops spanning installations across Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and the wider Gulf region, all simultaneously bracing for whatever response Tehran could generate. Maintaining that level of readiness for 5 consecutive months with no fixed end date and no clear endpoint visible on the horizon places an institutional and human strain that budget numbers and operational briefings struggle to fully capture. Heightened alert is not simply soldiers sitting at their posts, it means air defense crews operating at sustained maximum readiness around the clock. Interceptor batteries kept armed and ready for immediate engagement, medical units configured for mass casualty response, logistics chains continuously resupplying fuel, munitions, and equipment to bases scattered across 6 countries simultaneously. Every one of those 50,000 service members represents a family at home following the news and trying to understand whether tonight is the night. Their loved one's base becomes the next headline. 5 months of that, with no clear horizon in sight, is a weight that accumulates in ways that operational briefings and press statements don't always account for. The diplomatic picture running alongside all of this military activity is more complicated than a simple war or peace binary suggests. Even while this heavy wave of strikes was underway, and in the days that followed, an active diplomatic track was clearly functioning in parallel. Just days after the operation concluded, the United States announced plans for a follow-on strike package, only for President Trump to personally announce that the planned operation was being stood down. The reason, according to Trump's own account, both Iran and in several Middle Eastern governments had asked him to hold back. Trump confirmed he had spoken directly with the Saudi Crown Prince, who had raised concerns about new strikes further destabilizing an already volatile region. That specific detail matters. It confirms that Gulf partners like Saudi Arabia carry real and immediate influence over how aggressively Washington is prepared to push this campaign, because Riyadh's own economic exposure is directly tied to whether the Strait of Hormuz remains open and functional. Saudi Arabia depends on that waterway for its own oil exports. That dependence translates into tangible leverage over American decision-making, leverage the kingdom appears prepared to actually use. A military analyst covering the Strait situation framed the dynamic plainly. Saudi Arabia faces genuine economic risk in this conflict, and that exposure gives it a real seat at the table when Washington is deciding what comes next. The pattern that produces maximum military force 1 week, a canceled operation the next, shaped partly by Gulf ally intervention, reveals something essential about the actual character of this war in its 6th month. It is not moving in a straight line toward either decisive victory or negotiated peace. It is oscillating between genuine escalation and genuine restraint, sometimes within the same week, driven as much by economic pressure from regional partners and quiet back-channel diplomacy as by any individual battlefield outcome. Iran's own wartime military command has been explicit about how it reads this entire pattern. The head of that command publicly accused Washington of deliberately accelerating toward a full-scale regional conflict. using neighboring countries' territory, capital, and infrastructure as a buffer for American interests while reinforcing Israel's broader military position across the region. Whether or not the characterization reflects what is actually driving U.S. decision-making, it reveals precisely how Tehran is choosing to frame this war, presenting itself as a nation under coordinated siege rather than a government that has repeatedly launched missile attacks, violated signed agreements, and continued threatening commercial shipping in one of the world's most critical waterways. That framing strategy is aimed primarily at two audiences: Iran's own domestic population, which needs a narrative capable of sustaining support for a grinding and costly war, and the broader Muslim world, where a story of resistance against overwhelming American force carries political value regardless of the underlying factual record. The actual facts, missile strikes on Jordan, systematic violations of the MOU, continued harassment of Strait of Hormuz traffic, tell a considerably more complicated story about who escalated at each specific stage. But in information warfare, the narrative that travels fastest often has very little to do with which facts are most accurate. There's also a broader historical pattern worth drawing out here, because this heavy wave strike is not an isolated tactic invented specifically for this moment. It echoes the exact same overwhelming multi-axis approach the United States used at the very start of this war back in February, when Operation Epic Fury struck more than 5,000 targets in its opening days alone and damaged or destroyed 50 separate Iranian naval vessels within the first 10 days of the campaign. That opening operation set the template. Overwhelming simultaneous force applied across the broadest possible target. Set, designed to establish dominance before Iran's own defensive and retaliatory networks could fully organize a coordinated response. What played out in this most recent heavy wave is, in many ways, a scaled echo of that same original doctrine. Applied again 5 months later, specifically because a more restrained approach through the ceasefire and diplomatic periods in between had clearly failed to stop Iran from continuing to threaten shipping and launch attacks against American forces and regional partners. When graduated pressure and diplomatic openings don't produce durable behavioral change, the playbook returns to the one instrument that has consistently demonstrated the most immediate impact on Iranian military capability: overwhelming simultaneous force applied across the broadest feasible target set. So what does this specific moment actually tell us about where this war stands as it grinds into its 6th consecutive month? The honest picture is a conflict locked in unstable equilibrium. The United States retains the capability to launch a strike package twice the size of any recent predecessor, hitting 5 provinces and 3 islands within a single operational window, on the basis of 1 provocation and roughly 24 hours of preparation. Iran retains enough resilience and distributed capability to strike back against 2 separate neighboring nations within days of absorbing that kind of force. And underneath all of it, a real diplomatic track continues to function. Influential enough to cancel a planned follow-up operation based on direct appeals from Gulf partners and, by Trump's own account, from Iran itself. Neither side is close to forcing a clean resolution. Neither side appears willing to simply absorb what the other has done and walk away. And the volatility that produced one of the largest single-strike packages of this entire conflict, in response to 5 nights of quiet, is clearly nowhere close to being resolved. This war is still very much alive, and its next turn could come from almost any direction.